the market where the profit are effectively made. And traditional tax systems are well equipped for taxing companies which are physically located in that jurisdiction, but not that well equipped for companies operating from abroad. At some point in the discussion, our American partners have pushed for broadening the scope and having not only the digital sector, since they felt that it could lead to some kind of geographic imbalance in the coverage of the Pillar 1, and wanted to address also what is called the consumer-facing businesses, that is, the more traditional activities in other sectors. This has led to an extreme complexity in the approach, and for this reason it has been argued more recently that we should probably consider a staged approach whereby the OECD try first to get a system in action for the digital sector and move only at a later stage for other companies. We think it makes sense, if only because operating the discussion on Pillar 1 is challenging, technically. If you share profits of multinational among a large number of jurisdictions, you need de facto some kind of ex-ante agreement between the country concerned. If you do it for digital company, then the number of companies impacted is probably on the low side of the triple digit. If you do it for digital company and consumer-facing companies, then we're talking something about 7,000 to 8,000 companies. So now imagine what it means for tax administration to need to look for some kind of ex-ante agreement between 10 to 15 tax administration for 7,000 to 8,000 companies. It's rather a difficult task, to put it mildly. And against this background, it is certainly better to first get experience with implementing these rules with the digital sector before getting to a possible extension. The second OECD workstream, which is very important and even more important from a financial point of view, is a bit a leftover of BEPS, so it has nothing to do whatsoever with the digital sector. It's about minimum taxation. So we are not discussing within the framework of the OECD setting a minimum rate. That is not what is being discussed, so no country will be forced to change this rate. But we're discussing about setting a set of rate which would allow either the country where the group was located or countries where a subsidiary is located to compensate from a lack of taxation of the subsidiary at group level or of the flow between the subsidiary and the group in the country where the subsidiary is located. The most commonly discussed effective taxation rate, which would be used as a benchmark, even though it's not agreed yet, it's 12.5%, so we'll probably be somewhere around this area. That would be an extremely important step in fighting the race to the bottom between countries on company income tax. Because if it is not forcing country to change their rate, de facto it creates a situation where if they don't, the other can somehow use their tax base and overtax the company which are located in that country. It is not that important for the United States since the US have already the GILTI system. The main difference with the GILTI and BEAT system is that the GILTI and BEAT operates on a in a global blending approach. That is, you compute globally the average of the effective taxation, and if you're below a certain threshold, then you tax more. While what is being discussed in the OECD is what is called a jurisdictional blending, whereby we do the calculation country per country. So the OECD approach is more challenging technically, but puts also more pressure on tax haven to change their approach. Because with the US approach, since you average everything, you can very well have countries that keep a 0% rate or a very low rate without suffering from any particular disincentive, while with the approach under discussion at the OECD, if they do it, they run the risk of just losing their tax base and having all the companies located on their territory being seriously overtaxed by other countries. In terms of timing, it's been a bit of a moving target. That's the challenge we are all facing. To be fair, it is a very difficult discussion, and we're really talking of complete reconstruction of the international tax architecture. So thinking that it could be done very quickly and easily was probably a bit naive. Good progress has been done with the blueprint, which have now been endorsed, but we are not there yet. So this year we were hoping for a deal in spring, then in October. Now it has been agreed at the OECD and confirmed at the G20 that the new target is mid-2021. Right. And from a European point of view, this target has to be interpreted as mid-2021 at the latest. We do not want to enter into a game where we would face another moving target. And the Commission, President von der Leyen and Commissioner Gentiloni have been very, very clear that should fail to reach an agreement at the OECD, we would table our own proposal and call it a day.
Interesting. That brings me to the other issue, which is the political element to this. So given that we're in the middle of elections, which Mark Prager is going to talk a little bit about later, and the trade discussions, how do you see this in the near future playing out in terms of European countries enacting perhaps digital services tax legislation?
Difficult and important question at this moment. A bit of history first. In 2018, the Commission had made a proposal for a digital service tax. This proposal has not gathered the unanimity is needed for being endorsed in the European Union. It's been used and there's a big echo. I hope you can still hear me. France, Italy, Austria, and we have also measures in Spain and Czech and Belgium. Beyond Europe, you have the DSTs, which are being prepared or adopted in many countries. Turkey. As far as the European is concerned, the primary intention behind the original of the DST and the DST which has been adopted by some member states was to have a temporary quick fix that put pressure on the various players to get all these have been adopted with all their imperfection, because we all know that this is a system which has some difficulties attached, was not supposed to stay. The United States adopted a trade procedure under Section 301, originally against France, and France remained the most advanced at this stage with the threat of trade sanction from the United States for an amount of $1.5 billion US dollar, if my recollection is correct, which is a multiple of the intended tax collection coming from the French GST. So far, at the moment, we are in a situation of armed truce. That is, the United States have suspended the sanction, and France has suspended the collection of property. The US Minister Le Maire has been extremely clear of its intention to start collecting property at the end of the year. The election may have an impact in several respects. The first one is that we have seen patent reluctance of the current administration to engage in the discussion related to Pillar 1. This was already visible at the beginning of the year when we had the ministerial meeting in Riyadh in February, where Secretary Mnuchin has not hidden his lack of enthusiasm for the process. This has been made even more clear in a change of letter over the summer, where Mnuchin has written to some of his counterparts asking to pause the discussion on Pillar 1, arguing that there are also priorities, notably because of the pandemic. So if the current administration stays in office, unless there is a big surprise, one probably assume that their appetite for concluding Pillar 1 will remain limited. The United States have always said at the beginning of the year that they are not against it, that they want a safe harbor, which would be some kind of optionality whereby the companies could decide to opt in the OECD framework or not. We struggle a bit with this concept of optionality very clearly. The United States have never a simple question, which is what would happen for the companies that would not? Do they consider, for instance, that it's legitimate to have GSTs for these companies that would not? That's a key question, and that is a question that is left open. If we have a new administration, it doesn't mean that the US position will necessarily change. That is up to the new administration, obviously, to take a decision. But maybe one can assume that the new Biden administration would probably be more attached to the multilateral framework and to making sure that the United States participate actively and positively the international efforts in finding good tax solutions globally. So in that sense, we would probably have a better chance to have a package deal if we have a Biden administration. But all this is speculative, because by definition, we don't know whether it will be an administration, and if we have a new administration, we don't know what guidance the president would give to that administration. So that explains why most OECD participants, including the European Union, have accepted with quite eagerness to conclude the need to wait for the election to take place and see whether it translates into a change of position of one of the key players in this discussion.
Okay, that's very helpful, and that's actually a good segue to Mark. And Mark, I hope our technical issues are straightened out. You look okay. I think. But Benjamin was talking about the outcome of the election, which is obviously speculative. But can you give us some insight of what's happening, and then what is for the OECD project?
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and pleasure to be here with you and Benjamin this morning. So let me talk about three things on the election. One, I'm going to just give us a very brief report on kind of the state of the data. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about kind of two different scenarios post-election. And then third, talk about the consequences of those scenarios. So the data right now, a very good metric to keep your eye on is the Real Clear Politics average. It's a series of polls of various different accuracies, perspectives, etc. So right now, it's showing a substantial lead for former Vice President Biden, 9.2% overall. You have to also look at the battleground states, largely upper Midwest, Florida, Arizona. The upper Midwest is really dominant in that. the top battlegrounds, former vice president, on average, is up by about 4.9%. And the betting odds substantially favor the former vice president. There's another key race that's going on, and that is in the Senate, the old body I worked in. The Senate right now, the Real Clear Politics average is showing us at about roughly a split Senate, 51-49 Democrats to Republicans when you push the leaning polls. So that's kind of the state of play now. If you kind of 2+ weeks out, the other thing to look at when you're looking at this data is that there are a lot of uncertainties in the U.S. climate right now. One is the COVID effects on the mechanics of voting. Many states are in a situation that they have not been in before in terms of using a combination of mail-in ballots, more stress on absentees. There is a lot of early voting going on. Anytime you go away from the on-site live voting, there are going to be issues, especially if it's a first-time event. The other thing that I would note in the uncertainties is the substantial resources the Democrats have and have been deploying in the races. Their money advantage is considerable and has played a big part. And then the third uncertainty is, I think American journalists are borrowing a term from the British journalists called, the British journalists talked about shy Tories, shy Tory voter, and its effects on surprise Tory victories in the late teens. There's a question of the shy Trump voter, and we'll just have to see. There isn't a lot of very good data on what that factor is. Anyway, by virtue of common metrics, former Vice President Biden looks ahead. Democrats should, at a minimum, improve their margins in the Senate and perhaps in the House, and could take control of the Senate. Now, why does that matter? Well, you have two scenarios to think about. One is a status quo scenario, where you still have divided government, and that can come in two forms. One, you could have a former Vice President Biden become President Biden, and then secondly, you could have, and the Republicans keep the Senate, or on the other, you could have the flip. It's more likely, when you look at the polling data, that if there's going to be status quo, that it's more likely that you would have a Republican Senate and a former Vice President Biden. But we'll have to see. And the other is the Democratic sweep. So I think you got to think of those two scenarios. Those are two very different consequences. In the first scenario, on the legislative front, with respect to the OECD work product, with respect to what Benjamin's group, the EU, is working on, some of the other initiatives, how the U.S. would respond, there will be, the key thing there is if you have a Biden presidency, is there will be changes in those key policy-making jobs in the administration side. It's very customary for the Treasury Secretary, other cabinet officials, and sub-cabinet officials to leave when the administration changes. So you could have a lot of changes there. On the legislative side, probably not as many changes, but Democrats and Republicans would obviously have to work together with the president to change the code. On the Democratic sweep, you could have substantial changes in tax policy, including how the Congress might respond to the OECD work product and measures that the European Union may pursue. In that case, in the Democratic sweep, they're going to have to stand up a government. In the U.S., there's a lead time. The president is inaugurated on January 20th, and then the key cabinet posts, including the Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, and sub-cabinets like the Assistant Secretary, all have to go through what's called a confirmation process in the Senate, and that involves vetting and committee hearings and votes in the committees and floors. So there's a certain lead time involved before the policy is enacted. So that's important consideration in the Democratic sweep too. The government won't be stood up right away. And I actually think that the OECD's pushing off of the date, the production date, until the middle of next year is a helpful development, because that will give, if there's a Democratic sweep, that will kind of mesh with likely the standing up of government in the U.S. on the administration side. So what are the consequences? So in terms of the U.S. reaction to these measures, you need to change the Internal Revenue Code and or change treaties, depending on what the Congress would decide to do. The Internal Revenue Code changes require both the House and Senate and, of course, a presidential signature. The treaties are Senate-only exercise requiring a supermajority vote. I will say I want to make one observation, too, about the scenario. The Finance Committee has jurisdiction over trade and taxes and a lot of health care. You're going to have a change there no matter what happens in the election. Senator Mike Crapo is likely to be the top Republican, and he is from the state of Idaho, a neighboring state, the state I grew up in, Oregon. Senator Crapo has a long-time tenure on the committee, and so we'll have to see, Senator Crapo articulate what his vision of policy perspectives with respect to these issues and others that come before the committee. So that's something I want to point out. If the Democrats should sweep, Senator Wyden from my home state of Oregon becomes the chairman. And so that will mean a difference in terms of perhaps where the committee stresses. So you have to get the code changes through the Congress. And if you have a divided government, say Democrats are in the administration and you still have Republican Senate, you're going to work through these issues. The other thing other observation I'll make is I think the U.S. policymakers will focus on how is TCJA working as planned. That's a continuous exercise through hearings, meetings, etc. So that's an internal thing, internal policy discussion, of course, with conversations with our trading partners, but that will continue. In a Democratic sweep, I think former President Biden has indicated he would change some of the architecture of the TCJA. Of course, that again will depend on whether he has a Democratic Senate on the Hill or not. TCJA there are divisions of opinion on how well it's worked between Republicans and Democrats and what should be done to it. I'm not going to go into those right now, but that is just something to note. But I do think despite the differences on TCJA, you will find policymakers on the Hill, Democrats and Republicans, united on a couple points. One, they will look at all of these developments in the context of the U.S. tax base. Having made a substantial change with TCJA on both the business and the individual side, and frankly with the fiscal challenges that the policy responses to COVID-19 and other factors, there will be fiscal pressures in the out years that they will have to look at. So they will care about the consequences to the U.S. tax base, and so the Treasury Department, the Joint Committee on Taxation, and others that are the experts on forecasts and effects will be important in that discussion. The other thing where I think you will find them have agreement, although I'm talking really conceptual agreement here, maybe differences in terms of how they would react to specific pieces of where the project may end up. And that's on the impact on U.S.-based businesses and economic activity. So as you can see right now in the campaign, there is a key discussion going on, and it's going to continue, about whether TCJA helps bring investment into the U.S. and maintain investment in the U.S., and whether that investment coupled with it with better employment and a better economic result. So I do think policymakers may differ in terms of how they assess the tactics and strategies of TCJ in terms of the policy consequences, but they will be united in having a perspective of ensuring that the TCJA in the next stages carries out its intent, and that, of course, will inform the reaction on Pillar 2 and to some degree on Pillar 1. There's also a mix, of course, with the trade space here. The administration has taken a very direct position in terms of responding through trade, through tariffs and other measures on the tax changes, including DSTs. So that will continue. Again, the degree to which a new administration, if the former vice president is to prevail, the degree to which you might have more active engagement, and I think Benjamin was touching some on this, more active engagement on, with some of the international organizations like the OECD, to the degree to more interaction, is an open question. I do think the Treasury Department's had a good open channel of communication, been very involved at the staff and the principal level in those discussions. So, but having worked in the Delaware delegation for 6 years myself under Chairman Roth, when Senator Biden was the other Delaware senator, Delaware senators tend to have a kind of forward-leaning view on multinational globalist organizations like NATO, like the OECD, such as the WTO, all of those things. So again, the former vice president is a legislator. He has 44 years of service in the United States Senate, if you count. The vice president is the presiding officer. He is a legislator by record. And so, should the voters decide to put him in, that could be an opportunity, even in divided government, for some, a very cooperative legislative activity. If President Trump is reelected, I would expect more of what we have seen over the last 2 or 3 years in terms of tax policy, probably kind of lurching along to a certain degree on resolving some of the issues on TCJA, and more of what we've seen in terms of interface with the OECD and the EU, etc. He would be somewhat balanced in a sense by a Democratic House, as he has been, in terms of the ability to push those policies. So I want to get those observations out. Again, we're all waiting to see how November 3rd goes, and it may be that we may not know, for instance, the Senate results until January 5th, which is the runoff date for the 2 Georgia seats. One is a special election, and one is it's a regular 6-year election. So we may not know actually the majority in the Senate as late as January 5th, which is actually a day or so past when the rest of the Senate changes over in terms of the changes in offices. So I thought I'd share those observations today, and thank you, Mark, for the opportunity to do that.
Yep, thank you. And I'm just going to put you pressure here on who you think is going to win. I think you gave us a lot of scenarios, and a lot of data. And I don't know is okay too. But I think you probably have a general idea of where you think this is going. Am I right?
My experience is when you look at polling data, if you have a lead outside the margin of error, I'm an accountant by training and then a tax lawyer, but I loved statistics in undergrad. Statistics was like my favorite class, and I think when you look at the confidence intervals in polling and sampling and models and the chi-squared and all the other factors, if you see a lead that's significantly outside the margin of error, That's pretty weighty evidence on the state of the race as of the date of the poll. Be very careful about that. Certainly, you look at the polls right now, and a 9.2% national lead is significant. I think it will narrow. I think that's the pattern of U.S. elections. We are a very divided country. When you take into account leaners and independents, where independents tend to go. If you look back at 2016, one of the reasons the polls missed the results of a Trump victory and some of the close Senate races going Republicans' way was that a lot of the polling stopped sampling voters significantly on Monday. And there was a block of voters who literally swung the last couple days. And these tend to be voters who are, frankly, up for grabs. We're a sharply divided nation, so I would expect that the partisan alignments will recompose themselves. Clearly, Democrats are aligned with the former vice president. They're going to vote for the former vice president in traditionally high numbers as percentage-wise. Republicans, there are some Republicans who, and especially in some of the battleground states, cohorts of Republicans who I think likely are to come home and will narrow those polling margins. The question is, what does that last group do? What do they do come Monday or even Tuesday? What is the state of play? What are the macro events that are affecting them? What does the economy look like? We're going to get third quarter economic data that will talk about GDP and employment and other things really close to the election. And it's probably going to be a decent number on the GDP side. If you believe Goldman Sachs and some of the other forecasting houses, the people in charge with it, U.S. GDP is probably going to grow at least 20% off a low base off the second quarter. How much of an effect will that have? Well, what will be the candidate's reaction to that? I don't know. Could that affect that last swingy group of voters? How much it seems like there's a COVID wave that has finally reached the upper Midwest, reached states like Wisconsin and Michigan and the upper Midwest region, which of course is the key battleground. Will that wave kind of be mostly on the downside, come the last week of October? We don't know, but that may affect it too. Will there be good news on a vaccine? Will we see other kinds of events that we can't forecast? And as usual in politics, there are always surprises. We've got another one that's popped up here in the last couple days. And you've really got the interesting phenomenon of tonight, two different town halls, which were originally supposed to be a town hall debate. And you've got another debate between the former vice president and President Trump, and whether there are consequences from that. I still tend to think that the electorate is going to kind of solidify its two bases, and so the polling will tighten up. I think that will happen, but it will be that last block of voters, and especially in the battleground states. I mean, if you look back over the last 20 years, the two Republicans that prevailed, the two Republicans that prevailed in the Electoral College lost the popular vote. George W. Bush in the 2000 election, and of course President Trump in the 2016. Now, President George W. Bush won a narrow popular vote in getting reelected, but you got to look at those two things very differently. There's really two different scorecards here. The national popular vote, which doesn't really matter in the end in terms of the Electoral College and the constitutional process, and the battleground states, which directly affect the Electoral College count. And so the key focus is on those battlegrounds, and how will those swingiest voters move in the last 2 or 3 days, really. And they move on. They move as they're walking into the polling booth or as they're dropping in that last mail ballot, whatever it is. And you always got things like weather too, right? You get a snowstorm in the upper Midwest. Do you get is there like a rainstorm down in Georgia or something? Those things are all the intangibles that affect the outcome. Although I will say the early voting is at record levels, which I think is to be expected considering all the circumstances. There's a sizable percentage of the electorate has already voted even today, and including the battleground states. But we'll have to see. Those are all factors that will play in. But again, I guess my basic kind of level set point is that the polling data, the average of the polls looks the former vice president, if the election were held today, looks to be in decent shape in terms of rounding up the electoral votes.
No, thank you very much. A couple things. Thank you, Mark. It's very helpful. Benjamin, we have a question from an audience member directed to you. It says the EU Commission wanted to table a proposal for a digital tax in early 2021. Given the new deadline of mid-2021, will the Commission wait? Will they wait?
Well, it depends on the definition of the word early, which we have never fully clarified. The difficulty on our side is that we have two processes running in parallel. We have spoken so far of the OECD process, which has a very strong global relevance, but we have a strictly European process as well, where the heads of state and government have decided that we will finance the EU budget via a number of new ways, and one of them is a digital levy. I don't think you should pay an excessive attention to the word levy. The people that drafted those conclusions are not necessarily tax experts and not necessarily knowledgeable in the difference between a tax and a levy, but it is to be read as financed by digital something. And for this, the deadline for us, the ultimate deadline for tabling a legislative proposal is June. So we have somehow to find a way to combine our strong attachment to the OECD process. We sincerely wish the OECD to be a success. I think it is best for everyone if we have a robust global agreement. With our own calendar, well, we have to come up with something by June, and obviously when you come up with something by June, you don't start drafting in June, you start drafting earlier by definition. So we are doing at the moment a number of options depending on how things develop, and the US election, as just explained by Mark, will be also one important parameter in our thinking.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to sort of follow up on with you. It's actually three parts to this, and you can take whichever one you like. Are there any elections occurring within EU countries that we should be paying attention to that are coming?
Well, we have 27 countries, so by definition, we don't have a year without an election.
Right.
And the attitude of European countries towards this OECD process tends to vary depending on the pillar. I think that a vast majority of European countries like the two pillars, but we have some countries that like the first pillar but not the second pillar, and some others that like the second pillar but not the first pillar. So the only thing on which everyone agrees is the usefulness of having an agreement provided we have both. And that adds an extra element of complexity in the current situation. Because we could very well imagine a situation whereby there would be an international consensus on the second pillar, but not yet on the first one. But we, European, somehow have to ensure at some point a transposition in Europe, having on board everyone. that is an extra complication for us. So far, we have maintained a very strong line that we want both and not dissociate them. If only because a dissociation would somehow diminish the chance of having the United States on board for the first pillar. There is no doubt that the United States wants the second pillar to succeed, if only because the OECD countries are willing to recognize a broad equivalence between globe and GILTI. So from a strict investor point of view, the existence of GILTI is a small comparative disadvantage for the United States. So if you have a global agreement, it's good for the United States because it takes out the small comparative disadvantage they have. While by definition, any agreement on Pillar 1 is likely to have a tax impact for the United States because of the importance of the American company in the digital sector. So for the dynamics of the negotiations, seen from a non-American point of view, it is much better to keep the link between the two pillars, even though in terms of content they are completely disconnected. They have nothing to do with the one or the other. But that gives a big chance of securing a package which is acceptable for everyone, including the United States.
Yeah, and I'm so sorry we couldn't connect with the OECD because they're managing a very large number of countries, close to 140, and seeking a consensus. And I can only imagine the difficulties that you could encounter doing that. But that leads to my other question. And Mark, I want you to chime in too if you want to. But process. Help us understand the process from the European community's perspective, and then from the U.S. perspective too, and what an ideal process would look like. You alluded to you like to see both pillars. You alluded to how you would like it, but practically and logistically speaking, how do you interact? You interact with the OECD, but how are you interacting with other organizations like the UN, who I understand recently are looking at treaty modifications that might affect digital taxes for developing countries? But how are all these other organizations interrelated with respect to what you want to accomplish?
Well, so far as far as taxes are concerned, our primary interlocutor is really the OECD and its members. UN does not play a comparable role. We have other dimensions sometimes that we have to take into account. One of them is the trade dimension. Thanks to the action of the United States, obviously there is also a WTO dimension to this discussion on digital taxation. It is very clear that if the United States move with a sanction, the European Union will stand by its member state and will defend it. It is in no one's interest to have trade tension, especially in the current global economic situation. No one has to win. But at the same time, the desire, notably of large European member states, to move on with an effective and fair taxation of the digital sector is very strong. So my clear message is to our American friends is do not assume that we will blink because of the threat of trade tension. We won't. We don't want those trade tension. We want a global agreement. But if by an extreme misfortune we were getting to this stage, then we would make sure that our member states are properly defended in the WTO and as foreseen in our treaty. Now, if we have an agreement in the OECD, let's take the positive scenario. The world doesn't stop. So the deadline which has been set mid-next year is a deadline for reaching a political agreement. That is, for having the political blessing and for the finance minister and possibly the head of state to say, oh, we're fine with this date. But you still have a lot of legal work that needs to take place after this, because this agreement needs to be transformed into a multilateral convention. That multilateral convention needs to be ratified. So all countries, the United States and the European Union, will have obviously to work on the parameter of that convention, then to ensure a proper ratification. And we know from experience that The Senate can be a complex stage in the ratification process. And then domestically, within the European Union, we have an extra intra-EU step, which is transforming this convention into EU law. You have EU proposal that will need to be discussed by our member states that will decide how we implement in practice among member states this OECD. So it's still a long road, huh? To be honest.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And I think we just lost Mark. Oh, there he is. He's back. So Mark, can you hear me? Okay. I'm not sure he can. Okay, that was helpful. What the other issue I wanted to mention is the third part of this thing, and I really appreciate you being candid. It's the economic aspect of this and the revenue estimates. I'm not an economist, and I'm a tax lawyer as well, but I'm intrigued by the numbers, which sometimes differ, as with respect to the revenue impact for a tax in each particular jurisdiction, and how those profits will be allocated and revenue. What do you think is the most reliable source for data on what type of revenue this might raise in terms of getting, if you go through the process that you just described and having ratification? Sources that are helpful, most helpful?
It's a very difficult exercise for seeing the consequences. The OECD has released an impact assessment, which you can find on their website this week. They have aggregated the data, so you won't find the data per jurisdiction, but they have communicated to each country separately the result of their simulation. It is easy to make assessments taking a static approach. That is, you look at the situation today, you run the system for Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and you see what the impact would be. It is far more difficult to make assessment taking a dynamic approach, and this is what the OECD is trying to do. Let me take you a simple example. For instance, if you had a global agreement on minimum effective taxation, what would be the impact, for instance, on a country like Ireland? Taxation is one element of the attractiveness of Ireland, but it's one of many. Ireland is also attractive because it has a skilled labor force, because people use English, because it has a flexible labor law. So being able to disentangle somehow the economic impact of taxation from the other factors and coming on a figure, this will be the impact on Ireland, is extremely difficult. As far as Pillar 1 is concerned, whatever the country concerned, one thing is sure, the impact is modest. Everyone knows it. It's built in somehow, because what is under discussion is discussing a new repartition of 20% of the profit above a 10% profitability benchmark. 20% above a 10% profitability benchmark. So the amount that is being shared globally is very small. In euro, it's even double digit in billion, globally. So you might say, is it worth the effort, considering the relatively modest impact? We think it is. We see it as a first step. Even though it's complex, even though it's heavy, even though the amount which will be redistributed is not spectacular, the journey in itself is extremely important, because that would be the first time that there is a global agreement on how to handle the profit of multinationals. And as such, that has a very strong value.
Right. Yeah, no, it does. And I've just seen what tax increases could raise annually. I see between 50 and 80 billion US dollars when you add the US minimum tax, $100 billion. So, I just want to know what numbers really make the most sense, which drives a lot of the political maneuvering, as you might suspect, Mark, and that's what drives a lot of politics, which kind of brings me, and we only have a few minutes left. And Mark, with respect to the international tax rules that you're mentioning, the GILTI, the BEAT tax, and so forth, that How do you, if we have a new administration, is there a risk that any of these changes could be reevaluated and ultimately impact what the OECD and the EU are trying to accomplish? Actually, Mark, he's speaking, but we can't hear you.
So
there you go.
How's this? Can you hear me now? Okay. And the question was breaking up a little bit, Mark, but I think you were asking about the revenue, the ability to estimate revenue and make evaluations from the policymakers' perspective. So in the U.S., we have really two key revenue estimating groups: the Office of Tax Analysis over in Treasury, who I know have had discussions with the OECD as they proceeded through this point. And the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is nonpartisan, serves both Democrats, Republicans on the Hill, and the Joint Committee scores bills and other things. And both keep track of baselines on how policy is working. They will periodically report on that, and then the Congressional Budget Office annually kind of gives a state of play of kind of what the effects on receipts are, the economics, et cetera, and policymakers pay very close attention to that. I think those are the two groups that the U.S. will have to look to. And certainly they have the capabilities to at least inform that decision. And I know the Joint Committee, for instance, are observers and involved in the OECD discussions in terms of spending, so they're up to speed with that. I want to make one comment on the process because we had some connectivity issue.
Okay, we have 1 minute.
That's what add to what Benjamin said, if I could. I think in the U.S. there's some the formality of the trade process, trade consultation with the Hill is very helpful in terms of bringing along trade agreements, which of course require a special track procedure and other things in the U.S. I think some of them would help the regular, and there is a lot of consultation, I won't say there isn't, but I think the kind of regular expected.
Oh, I think we might have lost Mark temporarily. Yvonne, do you want to make some remarks here at the end of the program? I see Yvonne.
And briefings that's frankly built into the U.S. fast track system on trade. It's very helpful, and just as an observer in a tax.
Okay. Mark, we just have a very difficult transmission and technical difficulties, but we are at the end of the program, and I want to thank our panelists. Benjamin, thank you very much for your time and your insight today. Mark, I want to thank you as well for joining us. I'm sorry the OECD couldn't join Yvonne, but Yvonne, do you want to make any closing statements before we wind up the program?
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. I definitely will. We will have a continuing. I mean, it's a continuing conversation. So once we have clarity on the election results in the spring, we will definitely have a follow-up discussion on this topic. And I was emailing with the colleagues at the OECD. We're going to bring them in at that point. And with that, we conclude today's webinar. And again, a big thank you to our panelists for sharing your insights. And this is a rather complex issue. And like I said, we will to be continued. I also would like to thank our audience for joining today's program. We are uploading a recording of this discussion on our YouTube channel. And you can find the link to the channel on our website at eaccny.com. And a quick reminder, we will make a list of attendees available after the event. If you are a member of the EACC and would like to connect to any of the other participants, we will be happy to facilitate that. And with that, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.